You'd assume that a self-driving taxi fleet is one of the simplest ways to print money in modern business. Take the single biggest expense in ride-hailing, the driver, and remove it entirely. No wages, no breaks, no sick days, a car that can run nearly around the clock. That math looks so obviously profitable that it feels less like a business plan and more like an equation. But the reality is that building a robotaxi fleet has turned out to be one of the most expensive, slowest, and least profitable bets a car company or tech giant can make, and understanding why reveals something that applies far beyond self-driving cars. Removing a cost from a business doesn't make that cost disappear. It usually means the cost moved somewhere less visible, and got bigger before it got smaller. Start with what actually happens when you take the driver out of a taxi. In traditional ride-hailing, driver pay is typically the largest single cost of running the service, commonly estimated to eat up somewhere around 60 to 70% of what a rider pays for a trip. That's the number every robotaxi pitch is built around. Eliminate that cost, the story goes, and the remaining revenue becomes almost pure margin. What that pitch leaves out is what has to replace the driver for the car to safely operate without one. A self-driving vehicle isn't a regular car with software installed. It's a regular car retrofitted with an expensive sensor suite, cameras, radar, and often LiDAR, a laser-based system that maps the environment in 3 dimensions in real time. Depending on the setup, that hardware alone can add tens of thousands of dollars to the cost of a single vehicle, on top of the base price of the car itself. Multiply that across a fleet of even a few hundred vehicles, and the upfront capital investment before a single paying ride happens is enormous. The driver's wage didn't vanish. It got converted into a giant hardware bill, paid entirely upfront instead of gradually per trip. That's only the first layer. Self-driving vehicles don't navigate cities using regular maps. They rely on extremely detailed, pre-built maps of every street, curb, traffic signal, and lane marking in the specific area they're allowed to operate in, maps that have to be built and continuously updated city by city before a fleet can even launch there. This is why robotaxi services don't expand the way a normal taxi app does, simply signing up drivers in a new city overnight. Expansion means months or years of mapping, testing, and regulatory approval for every single new market, which is why, years into this industry's existence, Robotaxis were still operating in only a small number of cities rather than nationwide. Here's where the story gets more counterintuitive. Even with all that sensor hardware and mapping, many self-driving taxi services haven't actually operated without human involvement. Multiple companies in this space have relied on remote human operators, sometimes called safety or support staff, who monitor vehicles from control centers and can step in, guide, or take over when a car encounters a situation it can't confidently handle on its own. The driver's job wasn't fully eliminated. Parts of it moved into a control room, sometimes with one operator overseeing multiple vehicles, sometimes closer to one-to-one, depending on how mature the technology actually is. The apparent product being sold to the public is a car with no driver. The actual product, at this stage of the technology, often still includes a human, just relocated and restructured rather than removed. So the cost structure that looked like it would collapse to near zero instead became a stack of new costs: expensive hardware per vehicle, expensive city-by-city mapping, and an ongoing remote workforce, all layered on top of the vehicle and insurance costs any taxi fleet already has. That's the chain reaction that's been quietly building underneath this entire industry. Enormous upfront spending, spread across a small number of markets, generating limited revenue for years, funded almost entirely by investor patience rather than actual fares. And investor patience, as this industry has learned, isn't infinite, especially when a single serious incident enters the picture. That's exactly what happened to Cruise, General Motors' self-driving taxi division. Cruise launched paid robotaxi rides in San Francisco and expanded aggressively through 2022 and 2023, positioning itself as one of the most advanced competitors in the space alongside Waymo, the self-driving unit backed by Google's parent company, Alphabet. By mid-2023, Cruise had expanded its driverless service into multiple additional cities and was operating around the clock in San Francisco, presenting itself as proof that fully autonomous, human-free taxi service was close to becoming an everyday reality. Then, in October 2023, a Cruise vehicle was involved in an incident in San Francisco in which a pedestrian, who had first been struck by a different, human-driven car, ended up under the Cruise vehicle and was dragged as it attempted to pull over. California's Department of Motor Vehicles subsequently suspended Cruise's permits to operate driverless vehicles in the state, citing safety concerns and, according to regulators, misleading information from Cruise about the incident. Cruise pulled its entire driverless fleet off the road nationwide shortly after, not just in California. What followed was the domino effect this whole cost structure had been quietly vulnerable to. A single high-profile safety incident didn't just cost Cruise operating permits. It cost the company the ability to generate any of the fare revenue that was supposed to eventually offset years of hardware and mapping spending, while every other cost, the vehicles, the sensors, the remote staff, the ongoing engineering, kept accumulating. Reporting on the fallout described significant leadership departures, staff reductions, and a broader reassessment inside General Motors of how much longer it made sense to keep funding an expensive and profitable robotaxi business. In December 2024, GM announced it would stop funding Cruise's robotaxi ambitions altogether, folding the technology into its personal vehicle driver assistance efforts instead of continuing to pursue a standalone taxi fleet. That outcome is the clearest proof of the underlying economics. It wasn't that self-driving technology definitively failed. It was that the cost of pursuing it, years of capital spending with a business model still generating relatively limited revenue in a handful of markets, became harder to justify the moment a safety crisis interrupted the story investors were being asked to believe in. Meanwhile, Waymo, backed by one of the wealthiest companies on Earth, has continued expanding into new cities and scaling ride volume, illustrating a harsher truth about this industry. The technology alone doesn't determine who survives. The depth of a company's willingness and ability to absorb years of losses does. So what does owning a self-driving taxi fleet actually look like, best case versus worst case? In the best case, with enough capital, enough cities, and enough time, the hardware costs per vehicle eventually decline, the mapping investment gets reused across a growing service area, and remote human oversight shrinks as the technology genuinely matures, eventually producing something closer to the low-cost, high-margin business the original pitch promised. In the realistic negative case, and the one Cruise experienced, the capital runs out or patience runs out before the technology and the cost curve fully mature, and a single serious incident can end years of investment almost overnight. Underneath the promise of cars with no driver, a self-driving taxi fleet was never really about removing a cost. It was about relocating that cost into hardware, mapping, remote labor, and risk, and betting that all of it would eventually shrink faster than a competitor's patience runs out. The companies that survive this industry long-term won't necessarily be the ones with the best technology first. They'll be the ones that can afford to lose money the longest while everyone else finds out exactly how expensive replacing a driver actually turns out to be.